lecture, we're going to continue our work on Augustine and think about Augustine as a theologian, and we're going to look at the Pelagian controversy. Augustine, as we talked about in the last unit, was engaged in multiple debates of different kinds throughout the course of his life and his career. We're going to look at the Pelagian controversy, a very hotly disputed theological debate in the Western Church. Before Augustine, as far as we can tell, the notion of human free will was assumed. That is, the idea that somewhere along the way, in the process of salvation, in the process of responding to God, human free will played a role. Not necessarily in the way that Pelagius talks about, we'll get to that in a few minutes, but free will played a role. Humanity had some part in at least responding to the grace of God. But Augustine's theology, as it develops, is very pessimistic about human beings. Augustine thinks that humans on their own cannot choose good. They're incapable of choosing good. Human beings are created in a way that they are unable to choose good. And he says at one point, in some strange way, the object we covet becomes all the more pleasant because it is forbidden. So like in the Garden of Eden, when God said, don't eat of that tree, because of humanity, because of something about us, that makes us want to do it. If God says, you shouldn't do this, that makes us want to do it more. Why? Because as human beings, we're sinful. There's something about us that we cannot choose to do good. He describes sin in more or less, well, kind of medical terms. He considers it a disease. Sin is a disease. It's a disease that all humanity has. So what does this disease cause? What's the effect of this disease? The effect of this disease is the loss of free will. When sin enters the world, human beings lose the ability to choose good. So why is it that human beings cannot choose good? Because all human beings suffer from the condition called sin. So as human beings, we can't say, I'm going to do better. No, as a human being, you can't do better because you have a disease. In the same way that a person who is missing both legs can't say, I'm going to run in the Olympics. There are limitations, right? There are limitations to humanity. And he says, we persevere. We persevere in our faith only through God's grace. Because ultimately, it's God and God alone who is doing all the work. So everything about the plan of salvation, everything about the process of salvation is the work of God. It's not like a football match or a soccer match where, well, yeah, God steals the ball and God passes the ball down the pitch and then he crosses it and we kind of head it in the back of the goal. No. God steals the ball, God dribbles the ball down the pitch, God shoots and God scores. That's the image. It's all God. Humans don't do anything. Maybe we can be there to cheer, and after God rips off his shirt, we can be there for that part, right? But that's it. God does everything. These are Augustine's ideas as he develops them. But not everyone agrees. Not everyone is so happy with this perspective. And one of his critics is a British monk named Pelagius. So Augustine tried to be a monk before he was kind of forced into more public life. Pelagius is actually a monk living in Britain. And Pelagius thought Augustine had some things wrong. Because when Pelagius read the Bible, he thought that he saw some evidence of human responsibility. He thought he saw, even in passages in Paul that Augustine thought maybe taught one thing, he said, if you read elsewhere, or if you read the whole thing, isn't there a reference to human responsibility? So he questions what Augustine said. And he thinks Augustine sounds too much like a Manichaean. He thinks Augustine sounds like a Manichaean. Manichaeans are fatalistic. Your fate is determined. Pelagius thought, Augustine, you left Manichaeanism behind, but some of those ideas have stuck around, and you still are carrying them with you. So Pelagius is questioning Augustine on these issues. So Augustine taught that sin was a disease that every human being had, and that we're really passed down genetically. Every human being is born a sinner. Pelagius disagreed. Pelagius thought and taught that human beings are born sinless. Human beings are born without sin. So he disagreed with original sin. Pelagius said there is no original sin. Human beings do not carry down on them the sins of their ancestors. Every human being who's born starts fresh. Every human being starts with, as we say, a clean slate, carte blanche. Therefore, infant baptism is not necessary, because an infant hasn't sinned. An infant is born sinless, and an infant can't understand what's going on, so you don't need infant baptism. So practically, you can imagine how this pretty quickly comes into conflict with Augustine. So what ultimately determines our fate? In Augustine's teaching, we're born sinners, and God determines in many ways what happens to our fate. Pelagius says no. No, our actions determine our eternal fate. The actions that we perform out of our own free will determine our eternal fate. If you get to heaven, it's a result of your actions. If you don't get to heaven, it's your own fault, basically. You can't blame God if you don't get to heaven. You made the choices, it's your own fault. So a very different model of what humanity is like and how the process of salvation works. So I'm going to break down this debate into the responses of Augustine and Pelagius to three questions. Some of these I've already hinted at, but let's come back and look at three questions that are critical to the debate between Augustine and Pelagius. First, what is the natural state of humans? What is the natural state of human beings? When human beings come into the world, what are they like? Pelagius teaches that human beings are born with the will to do good. Are human beings born fundamentally good or fundamentally bad? Pelagius says human beings are born fundamentally good. They want to do good. If they don't do good, it's because something eventually goes wrong. Something puts them off that track. But human beings are born wanting to do good. But for Augustine, this is completely wrong. For Augustine, the human will itself is broken, and God has to fix humanity through grace. Without grace, human beings have no possibility of doing good, no possibility of being right with God. Because the human will is broken. It has to be fixed. Now, does that mean that God shows grace and then human beings respond to God's grace? It's not even that. Even receiving God's grace is an act of God. So Augustine says a person doesn't receive God's grace because they decide to receive God's grace. They receive God's grace because God determines that they're going to receive His grace, and God, in essence, makes them receive His grace, or brings it about that they receive His grace. So without God's actions, humanity is born without a chance. Human beings have no chance unless God specifically intervenes with grace. So, what's the natural state of humans? Another question. Why do some people believe, but others don't? When the gospel is preached, why do some people come to faith and others don't? Why would Augustine eventually come to faith and some of his friends would not? Why within a family would the family raise 4 children the exact same way and 3 of them come to faith and 1 of them does not? And this happens all the time in families that we know. Why? Pelagius says it's free will. Pelagius says human beings have free will. Human beings have the ability to choose. They choose to accept the gospel or not to accept the gospel. They choose to respond to God's grace or not to respond to God's grace. But Augustine says it's about election. It's about being chosen by God. Why do some people believe and others don't? Because they're chosen. At the university that I attended, there was a man who would come, and I understand he's still coming to the campus. He would come to the middle of campus in the middle of the day when all the students are walking through, and he would preach. And very particular kinds of ways. He was, you're all going to hell, and all you girls are this, and you boys are that, and really in a very aggressive kind of way. And most people were put off by it. But if you stood back and watched, at the end of his preaching for 20 minutes or whatever, most people would follow it, but some people would come up and talk to him. Because something about his message appealed to them. Maybe they saw something in their own lives. Well, how does that happen? Well, Pelagius says because their free will, they decide that they want to respond to this. Augustine says, no, they're elect. There's something in them. They're chosen. So, but even the believing is not their work. Even the reception of God's grace is God's work. So the elect are given the grace to believe and then to act on it. It's all God's work. God doesn't bring things most of the way. God brings things all the way, according to Augustine. So we've talked about grace. So question number 3, what is grace? What is grace? What is this thing we call grace? Pelagius says grace is help from God. It's all the things that God gives humanity to help us be perfect. All the ways that God helps us learn to do good, and all the ways that the tools God gives us to be good people, like the law of Moses, the Old Testament. God gives us Holy Scriptures. And those Holy Scriptures teach us about what God wants. They help prepare us to be good. They help us on our journey. And the example and the teaching of Christ. The example that Christ gives and the teachings that Christ gives, which show up in the Gospels, these help us. How do we know the right way to live? Look at Christ. That's what God's grace is. It's giving us the tools and the help that we need and the examples that we need to learn how to live right. But Augustine says grace is medicine for the human will. Or maybe you could say the antidote for the human will. The human will is broken. The human will cannot respond to God. God's grace does what the human free will cannot. So it's God's help versus the medicine to break what is fundamentally broken about human beings. Furthermore, for Pelagius, grace is something that's really external. The grace itself is it's offered, but it's offered in a more passive way. And the human will, however, is active. So God offers grace. It's kind of out there for you. It's available to you. The writings of the Old Testament are available. The teachings and example of Christ, those are available. But in order for you to get to God, your human will has to act. You have to be active. And grace gives you the ability to be active. But Augustine says, no, grace is internal. It is within those who are chosen. Grace is active. The human will is passive. Human beings don't choose God. God chooses human beings. The human will merely responds to that. Well, let me state that even more specifically. It responds to it in the sense that the human will is not the actor. God's grace is active. God's grace makes you respond to God. And after God's grace has chosen you and elected you and made you respond to God, and it's in some sense fixed your will, then you begin to live out the Christian life. But that's only because God's grace, God's work has done everything. So what's the basic model of salvation? Is it that God does everything? Or do human beings have a role in salvation? And what is the role of human beings in salvation? So Pelagius was condemned at several church councils. In this theological debate, Augustine, for the sake of the church councils, Augustine wins. Several church councils say Augustine is right. Pelagius, what you're teaching is heretical. And we also know that the Pelagians, others who picked up on his ideas, bishops and teachers and priests and such, Pelagians were excommunicated. And in a later period, all Pelagians were banned from the city of Rome, because Rome wanted to be a place of pure doctrine. So in terms of church history, Augustine wins. In the Western Church, Augustine wins. Now, longer term, Augustine wins, but not in a pure form. So what becomes the official doctrine of the Western Church is a slightly softened form of Augustine. It's not full Augustinian thought. But eventually, in later councils in the West, is accepted as the official Western Church teaching, is a slightly softer version. So, for example, one of the understandings is actually it is possible for a human being to resist God's grace. Augustine would have said, no, it's not possible. But the doctrine that's developed and agreed upon in later councils in the West says, yeah, there's a possibility. A human being can have a hard heart toward God. So Augustine's thought wins, but not in its pure form. And today in the church, there are still debates about this, certainly within Protestantism. Those who would consider themselves Calvinists would align with their understanding of Augustine's teachings, that people are elect, they're chosen by God before the foundations of the world, and that there's nothing human beings can do to improve their standing with God. And if you are elect, no matter what you do, no matter where you run and try to hide, God's going to find you. And God's going to draw you to himself. Versus those who come from the tradition, sometimes called the Arminian tradition, named for a guy named Jacob Arminius, who was a writer in the 16th century, who had more an idea that no, human responsibility is part of this. There's human free will is involved here. And so people who are Calvinists sometimes call Arminians Pelagians. You're a Pelagian. By that they mean you're a heretic. So this debate about what exactly is human free will like, what are human beings like, what is God's grace, how does God's grace work, these are still questions that are being debated in some circles today in the church. Questions about the Pelagian controversy, Augustine and Pelagius. And by the way, I should say, there are places all along the spectrum between Augustine and Pelagius over time. If you look later, people like John Cassian have positions that are toward the middle, that seem to agree with some elements of Augustine, but some elements that may be somewhat more like Pelagius. So there's a spectrum here. And everyone's going to fall somewhere along the spectrum. Most people fall between these two positions. You have to remember, it's a debate. And in a debate, over time, we tend to be more, as the debate goes on, we tend to become more extreme in our positions rather than less. So at points, we imagine that both Pelagius and Augustine may state some of their positions a little more strongly than they would have in other contexts. So most Christians at the time, we have to imagine, are somewhere in between. Question? Yes?
What is the position of the Eastern Fathers?
What is the position of the Eastern Fathers on this? This is a very big and disputed question. I would say if we look for Augustine's position or Pelagius' position in the Eastern Fathers, I don't think we're going to find a pure form of either one of those. This is disputed by some theologians, and so I want to tread very carefully here. But my understanding of the Eastern Church Fathers is they're somewhere in between. They're somewhere closer to what John Cassian represents, which is certainly a strong emphasis on God's grace, that God's grace is reaching out to humanity, but also that human beings have some sense of responsibility. There is a human response. So it's not as if you're entirely dead and God does all the work, but also it's not the sense that you can work your way to heaven by doing all the right things. So I think that's where most of the Eastern Church Fathers, as I understand it, and again, that's somewhat debated, but I think that seems to be correct, that they're somewhere in between. They're not really having this conversation in the same way, but based upon what we can see in Cappadocians, and they're somewhere in between.